Hey folks, blessing to everybody. Thank you for finding this channel. If you are new to this channel, this is where I'm discussing a lot of topics that are never discussed in church. I'm questioning a lot of these bad images of God that we've been raised with, and I'm trying to have a dialogue with Christians as well as people who are not of faith to show a beautiful picture of God revealed in Jesus. So thank you for finding this channel. And today I wanted to expand on a short that I've created in response to the flood. So before I jump into it, just want to thank everybody for engaging in my content, for giving me those likes and subscribing. If you find this information useful, please give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate comments. If you disagree with me, just state your reasons and try to have a civil dialogue. I try to be civil with people as much as I can. Yeah, expanding on the flood. So this is one of those stories that you often find in children's Bible books because you have this story that's filled with animals. And, just like kids like going to the zoo and to safaris, this is a great story that for some reason people decided to include in Bible children Bibles. But unfortunately, it's actually a very sad story, very devastating story of God saying, "Oops, I made a mistake," and starting a clean slate. And that means killing thousands, if not millions, of people, animals who had nothing to do with anything, and basically restarting creation. Now, a lot of the comments I'm getting from, I would assume, more evangelical Christians that hold to a literal interpretation of Genesis, of a literal account probably of creation. And I just wanted to say that I believe this story reveals two things. So one, it reveals an ancient understanding of how the cosmos works, how the world works, and two, it reveals an understanding of how God works. So if we study ancient traditions, if we study ancient religions, we have a God behind every natural force. We have a God of the moon, God of the sun, God of Mars. We have a God of, thunder. We have God of war. We have all sorts of different gods that are understood to be the forces behind the forces of nature, and like God of fire, all these things that the ancient people tried to make sense of. And you have to understand that, Israel and this Jewish race, it came out of this world that was surrounded by them. So they had a huge influence that was on them. And um, you know, they were not in a bubble. They didn't, start civilization without any influence. And I think it's pretty clear by the amount of, tug of war that we see throughout all of the Old Testament with, the unacceptance of obeying to the law, worshiping other idols, and all that kind of stuff. So you have that. And if you're honest, as as a person who approaches faith with some sorts of reason, not just this is what they told me, this is what I believe, you realize that there are actually older stories than the flood that we have in Genesis. There's like the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's other ancient stories that we find throughout all sorts of traditions and all sorts of religions and cultures. We all have a very similar basis for a story. Now, some Christians use that as firepower, and they say, well, this proves that this flood actually happened. This was a catastrophic flood, and all nations, they all have this story because everybody came after Noah. Um, However, the scientific and archaeological and historical account is that after the Ice Age, about 10,000 years ago, once a lot of the ice started to melt, you had a lot of regional floods. You have a lot of valleys that got flooded because of the ice caps and everything that was surrounding them. Um, so there's lots of evidence of that, of these rushes of water that did happen. So that's one. So if this is the issue. It's like when you believe that you have to take every single account in Genesis as if this was historical fact, one, you're being untruthful to, and you are forcing something on a text that it never meant to say. You need to understand that this was an oral tradition, that this was a legend, some sort of an explanation of who we are as people, where we come from, all that kind of stuff. And we are forcing this 21st century, like, historical, archaeological, and scientific um, pressure on Genesis that it never meant to carry. This story has a lot of truth to it. Unfortunately, the truth is not in the details of literal, the whole world was covered with water type of stuff, because we don't find evidence. And I don't think that God would, like, test the faith. Would you believe His word or do you believe science? I think whatever we observe is the natural Bible. If we observe that this universe is very old, we're not going to say that God is testing our faith. I think God gave us the wisdom and the knowledge to be able to come up with instruments, to be able to come up with math and sciences in order to understand all these principles and the universe that surrounds us. So that's one. And then the second thing I wanted to point out is, if we, let's say we believe that this actually happened, um, now we have a moral issue. Now we have this God who, first off, seems like he makes mistakes, because we see that he regretted that he has created, this world, and so he's wiping it all out. And then two, we see that he actually fails with his plan, because we see that nothing really gets accomplished. He wipes out, these sinners, so to say, but then, the world gets populated with them again. Now, some Christians will point out and say, well, he was wiping out the Nephilim, these hybrids, angels with people, all this stuff. Um, if you hold to that, then you have to explain yourself when you get in later in the Bible and you have passages where they're scoping out these lands and they find descendants of Nephilim, these giant people. So it's like, if they really got wiped out, well, God didn't do a good job either. So how do I approach all this? I approach it as this is an ancient story of people trying to make sense of what happened. Back in the day, people understood that God stood behind everything. So these areas in these regions were actually flooded. These were local floods that happened probably in many places of the world, like I said, after the Ice Age. Um, and just like any other religion or any other culture would say, is that God is behind it. And obviously they would find some kind of blame, and this is what we see, scapegoating, we see throughout the whole Bible. We see somebody always has to pay the price. Somebody's always guilty. And in this story, it's all of these people who aren't truthful to God. So I believe that this was a cultural story of this is their own legend, that they explained their own flood story. And I believe that God had nothing to do with it. I believe that God is revealed in Jesus. And Jesus reveals us a God who rescues people from water, who doesn't kill people with water. We see a story of Jesus with his disciples in a boat, and we see these, big waves that were um, happening in this lake, and Jesus calms the storm. In Genesis, we see a God who creates a storm. And Jesus said that nobody has seen the Father. And I believe as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, my authority has to be on the person of Jesus. Once we start leveling everything, once we start saying that, you can have Jesus and you can have the Bible on the same level, everything's the Word of God, this is where you come up with a lot of problems and you have a lot of issues with morality. Because on one end, you can have God who is love, and on the other hand, you can have God who is wrath. And Christians try to, like, marry all that together, and I think they do a huge disservice to Jesus, because Jesus said nobody has seen the Father. And he tells his disciples, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Jesus is the perfect image of God. He is like, if God looks in a mirror, he sees Jesus. So everything that Jesus does and says, this is what God was always like. So I have to ask myself, does God ever change? If God never changes, then he can be a solid foundation. And then I typically ask a question to Christians who try to rationalize stories like the flood. And I ask them, okay, if God doesn't change, and let's say you pick a story from Old Testament where God says you have to go and commit genocide. If God doesn't change and if God tells you to do that today, would you do it? And Christians don't know how to answer that because on one hand they want to believe that God doesn't change. On the other hand, they know in their subconscious that genocide is wrong and they don't know what to do with it. So oftentimes they start to kind of beat around the bush and they never get to anything. So do I believe the flood happened? I believe local floods happened. I believe people that lived through those floods told their stories and those stories were passed down and it was their understanding of, what happened. Now, people I know will start quoting, Jesus, days of Noah, all that kind of stuff. You have to understand that Jesus was brought up as a Jew. He was taught all these same stories. And we see that Jesus, he never ever does anything that we see is depicted that God is doing in the Old Testament. Killing of people, giving instructions on how to commit genocide, destroying the planet, none of this stuff. He says, peace I bring you. I did not come to condemn the world, but to save it. So that is my case. And if you guys disagree, leave a comment. We can have a nice dialogue. I can have a follow-up discussion. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.